folks. So as Cheryl mentioned, my name is Angelique Medina, and I head up the Internet Research Practice at Thousand Eyes. I hope that most, if not all of you, are familiar with Thousand Eyes, but those who may not be, just very briefly, Thousand Eyes is focused on providing visibility into user experience. That could be a human user or a machine user connecting to any application or service over any network. And that any network piece is really critical, and it's in fact the reason why the company was founded, because there was a conviction that we had that users and organizations were going to be more dependent on external networks and services. And in fact, today, most organizations are swimming in a sea of SaaS and APIs and cloud services, and of course, all of the networks that connect those things together and to all of the internal environments. Now, as organizations become increasingly or leaning more into digital initiatives, quite often the focus is around the applications themselves. So re-architecting the application, moving it to the cloud, optimizing it, observing it, and all of those things are really important. But of course, the reality is that users are not sitting in data centers directly connected to application servers. They're connecting to applications over many, many networks, both private and public networks. And user experience today is very heavily mediated by a whole range of services like DNS, content delivery networks, cloud-based security, so security service edges, and that's just to the front door of the application. On the back end, and underneath the hood of what a user experiences as a unified kind of way of interacting with an application is actually a very atomized app that is often quite distributed. So you may have not just, of course, you don't just have your internal application code, you're also going to be connecting and making calls to third-party APIs, to maybe platform services, AWS Lambda, AI models, as well as your origin site, various data centers, business systems, and really the list goes on. So amidst all of this, this is really kind of where we come back to the topic for today's talk, which is what happens when even a single link in that interconnected chain breaks. And one of the things that we've learned over the years, and I've been covering outages and doing research at Thousand Eyes for over 7 years at this point, is that there's some very clear distinctions between organizations that are more resilient and that have better outcomes in the face of effectively, in many cases, the same outages or just as complex and heterogeneous environments that they're working with. And so what we're going to talk about today is what some of those learnings are. And I'm going to be very specific and concrete in some of the examples here, so it doesn't just become an exercise in kind of very high-level abstract concepts. So I'm going to kind of break this down into a quasi-life cycle organization. So starting with prevention, and then, of course, preparation, detection and diagnosis, all the way through to optimization. And I'm also going to assume in talking about some of these examples that there's already visibility in place. So that's kind of foundational. You need to really have the ability to see and understand the conditions, not only in your internal environment, but also your external environment. And I hope that the reason why that's essential will become clear as I go through some of these examples. But that's really kind of, again, I'm going to make the assumption that that is already in place, that's the foundation, and then we can kind of build from there. So the first learning that I'm going to focus on, I would say that this is in fact probably one of the most important, and it's also one that I think can seem almost too obvious. And this is really about prevention and not just having visibility in place, but really understanding how do you use that solution that you have. Now, what we've oftentimes seen is that even for organizations that have great visibility solutions, the way that they're using monitoring and visibility, it's as a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. So they are using monitoring to tell them when something has gone terribly wrong. And that's fine. I mean, obviously, you should have that awareness, but many organizations that I would consider to be much more resilient and really kind of following best practice is they use their monitoring as a leading indicator to effectively tell them their digital posture at any given time, the health of their applications and services, and what their users are experiencing. And typical orgs, again, they'll put alerts in place, and then they'll oftentimes completely forget about what they have available to them in terms of visibility, whereas best practice organizations will use visibility in and embed it effectively into their daily IT operations. So they'll use it to do things like validate policies that have been changed, or understand how routes are being propagated once they brought on a new service provider. All of these digital assets that organizations have, each of them have their own life cycle. I mean, you have maybe a DNS provider, maybe a CDN provider, your internal network, your ISP. There's a lot of care and feeding that goes into ensuring all of these things are working in isolation, but also in fully understanding the interconnectedness of these things, how changing one thing may have unintended consequences for a user somewhere. And that can oftentimes not be immediately obvious if you're just using your management systems to make changes and assuming that nothing immediately breaks, that you're in the clear. So really using these monitoring and visibility solutions to understand what could potentially be a problem down the road. Maybe it isn't today, but what could be. So I'm going to give an example. This is a real incident that happened a couple of years ago to a very large, well-known enterprise SaaS solution. So this company, they had an incident in which it was a fairly routine kind of problem that they were experiencing. One of their data centers had a service provider connected to it that they noticed started dropping packets. And the service provider subsequently started flapping routes to its peers, and so they, I would assume, discussed among themselves, and most data centers are dual-homed. You're going to have a backup provider. And so they made the decision to effectively disconnect from the service provider in question. But what they didn't realize was that the service provider, or the secondary service provider that they thought they were connected to, they hadn't actually properly configured that connection to them. And so, I would consider this organization as fairly sophisticated. I mean, they built a SaaS application from the ground up, very successful. But amidst the confusion between different teams, nobody had actually validated that the service provider had been properly onboarded. And so as a consequence to this, they disconnected themselves from the internet and took themselves offline for about an hour before they figured out what was going on. And the reality is that they could very well have done this, obviously at the time that they were bringing on their new service provider. But even before they made a drastic decision to effectively disconnect from one of their peers, but they didn't do that. There was so much conditioning around being very alert-driven and not really using the visibility that they had available to them. It just wasn't part of their practice. And so, this is an example in which, it could very easily have been avoided. So there was really no reason to get to the point where they were using their visibility solutions to identify the problem, to remediate, and then from there to validate that they're coming back online. So that's the first learning I'll share. Second is really around the impact of outages. So what we've seen is that oftentimes, when we have a very large-scale outage, like for example, a cloud provider, maybe it's a very large global transit provider, or in the case of the example that I'm going to get into, a content delivery network provider that also offers DDoS mitigation services. These are services that have vast, highly distributed networks. And in particular, when enterprise often use these services, again, like a cloud provider, they often assume that there's a certain level of immunity that they're buying themselves by using these services. And what we've seen is that the organizations that are better equipped to deal with these issues, they really expect that these services are going to fail at some point. So in this particular example, I'm going to mention the vendor because I think everybody here is probably pretty aware of this particular incident. But Akamai had a pretty significant, well, really global outage of their DDoS mitigation service a few years ago. And because of the nature of this service, and they front-end a lot of financial services, banks in particular, but others, they effectively advertise the prefixes of their customers. And it's, given how distributed they are and kind of how they are advertising so broadly, it may make sense to some orgs to assume that it's very unlikely that something catastrophic is going to happen. But in this particular incident, it was very interesting that we saw two different banks that had very different impacts based on this outage. So there was a bank in Australia. They were down for more than 2 hours, and there was a bank in the US that was only down for a few minutes. Now, there was a few differences here. In the case of the bank that was really only impacted for a few minutes, they had a covering prefix in place. And so what had happened, Akamai had some internal disruption, and they effectively withdrew all of the prefixes they were announcing from the internet. And so now their customers were no longer visible on the internet. Now, the good thing is that they withdrew them. They weren't just advertising them and having their network be under duress, which basically allowed the large bank to very quickly recover from this issue because the traffic just immediately diverted to their data center. And so they had no major disruption. Whereas this other bank, they were not advertising their own prefixes. They didn't have a secondary provider. So, effectively, they had no backup plan. And, not every organization is going to have the ability to do a covering prefix. But even if you just have a /24, you do have the ability to have a backup provider in place and be connected in such a way that you can then start advertising that prefix yourself. And so that was really a very interesting example of pretty stark difference between one organization that was effectively not disrupted by an incident, whereas another one that was down for over 2 hours. It was in the middle of the day. It was highly disruptive. The overall impact of this outage was in the billions of dollars because it effectively almost exclusively impacted financial service organizations. So it's just an example here of even if you're reliant on a large provider, you have to assume they're going to fail at some point, and you should plan accordingly. The next one I'm going to talk about is the overall complexity of services today and how they interact with one another. It can often be that even if you have visibility into your corner of your scope, your users, your applications, that oftentimes it's very helpful to understand whether or not what you're experiencing is something that is specific to you or is something that's shared by users more broadly. So for example, you might have an issue with your cloud provider or your CDN provider and need to very quickly understand whether or not if this is a broad issue or if this is something you need to address directly maybe in your configuration or directly with that provider. Now, one interesting kind of example, this happened about a year ago. There was a outage in a broadband provider in the US. Now, this particular provider is very large. They serve a huge number of users in the US across different geographic regions. And they had an outage that was localized to a POP they had in Texas. Now, when this outage occurred, there was a lot of chatter, and this was all coming on the West Coast. So, folks in San Jose and LA, folks in our office in San Francisco, and folks who were working remotely were also experiencing this issue. And what was really strange about this issue was that very soon after it started happening, all of the chatter on social media, it started to kind of gravitate towards AWS. AWS was having an outage. And more specifically, it seemed like they were having an outage in their US East region. The reason why it started to immediately there's this red herring came into play is actually pretty interesting. So and kind of touches on a number of really interesting aspects to how applications are delivered today. So Comcast is an eyeball network, and so folks are connecting through them to lots of different applications, right? And typically when folks think about an ISP outage or their network is down, it's usually something that's going to impact a lot of applications. You're not going to be able to reach anything. You won't be able to resolve DNS. It's pretty, broad in terms of its scope. But the interesting thing with this was that folks could access pretty much everything. You're sitting in whether in LA or San Francisco. You could reach Netflix. You could, access Gmail. You could access all your productivity applications like Outlook, and there wasn't really any impact there. And it's really because traffic doesn't go very far to reach a lot of these applications. They're relying on extensive edges. They could have CDNs. In the case of the cloud providers, they're going to be front-ended by, whether it's Google services or Microsoft. Your traffic doesn't really go very far to reach these services. And in the case of AWS, in this particular region, for folks that were trying to reach instances hosted on the East Coast, that traffic, because of how AWS advertise their services, they don't advertise broadly. So they're advertising only really where their region is located. That traffic is going to go over the internet and only get into AWS's network when it reaches, in this case, Virginia. And that is really why that particular cloud provider was heavily impacted by this, because that traffic actually had to travel along the extensive backbone of this provider. So going from, in this case, San Jose or LA, all the way through Texas and, the East Coast and then up to Virginia. And so, and other cloud providers like Google and Azure weren't impacted because they advertise very differently. But all of these things are important because, again, the overarching kind of narrative that emerged initially was really around AWS as the culprit here, to such an extent that they actually issued a statement. And so, this is an instance in which being able to very quickly disambiguate and sort of get to the heart of where an issue is really important. So this is, again, having that macro visibility, being able to understand, is it you or is it something that is impacting other customers is very critical. The other interesting thing about this particular outage is that a lot of folks have this perception that if the incident is taking place in an external network or an external service, and in particular, if you don't have a commercial relationship with them, maybe they're a service provider that's connected further upstream to your own transit or ISP, that you don't really have any ability to mitigate the issue. And in the case of this particular Comcast outage, what was also kind of interesting about this was that we had a customer who, again, they immediately saw that this was a Comcast issue. They also understood that for their employees who were not able to reach some of their workloads in US East in AWS, that the way that they could very quickly get around this issue is to connect to their VPN. Because their VPN was connected to multiple service providers, so they could effectively route their traffic around the backbone issue that Comcast was having. The other really critical thing here is to understand, what does good look like? So obviously, it's really important to monitor for availability, but understanding your performance in the context of what it should be is also critically important. And oftentimes, that can't happen if you don't really know what that is. So for example, there's different platform services, like Salesforce is an example of this, in which their customers are directly building on top of this platform. And everything that they're building on top of this platform is going to impact users, and depending on where they're sitting. And so understanding that performance and also knowing, what are the thresholds of experience that I need to be hitting. A lot of folks have KPIs, and they don't really even have much meaning, because all they're acting on is whether or not users are complaining. And that's effectively kind of, obviously it's good that users are not complaining, but if your application is performing poorly relative to, say, a similar service, then maybe users are not complaining because they're not trying to use the application. They've just moved on. And so really understanding what are your baselines, understanding how you compare to your industry peers, and also understanding, for example, in the course of various initiatives, if you're making changes to your network, or maybe there's an initiative to migrate certain workloads to a cloud provider, understanding what your baseline is before you make any changes, and then understanding where you're landing afterwards is really critical, not just from the standpoint of ensuring that you haven't broken anything or that you're meeting certain targets, but also being able to determine whether or not this change was meaningful to you. Did you improve performance? It's helpful to, again, have that baseline and understanding where you're at before you make changes like that as well. So summarizing takeaways, so obviously visibility is essential. You have to have that in order to be responsive and understand immediately where a problem domain is. Otherwise, what typically will happen is you're going to just have to wait out the issue, or you're burning cycles determining if it's an internal issue versus an external issue, or if it's a network issue versus an application issue. And if it is a network issue, whose network is it? There's so many different variables. And it's not sufficient to just have visibility through various management platforms, because oftentimes the impact of changes in a silo are not going to be evident or immediately evident unless you have the perspective of the user. So for example, you could have a completely working application. You could have users that are distributed, connecting to the network, to the front door of the application. Everything is working. And this is actually a real example where the network team was effectively trying to troubleshoot why there were timeouts for certain users trying to reach an application. Now, it turned out that the SRE team had and their cloud ops team had made changes to a security policy in AWS. And what that effectively did was that blocked certain users. So there was all that time where they were trying to figure out what was happening. On the SRE side, when they made that security policy change, it didn't break anything. The application was perfectly fine. There was no impact otherwise, but they didn't realize that they were actually blocking this traffic. And so having that proactive visibility in which you can effectively test out any change to any of these variables and understand it really from a systems approach versus just, hey, I made a policy change here, the network didn't go down, but actually it may have some unintended consequence that you don't realize until later, or you won't realize until users try to access something and then you've kind of are in the midst of an issue. So again, visibility should really be embedded into daily IT practices. So runbooks, being very specific on how you would integrate this into your consequential moments from an IT standpoint. And then really, again, using visibility as a leading indicator. How am I performing? What is the impact of a particular change? Model out that change versus just using it to tell you when something has gone wrong. So I hope that was helpful. Feel free to check out some of the resources that we have on our site. We're covering outages there, so you can subscribe to our blog. We also have research reports out that cover everything from DNS performance to the networks of cloud providers. So again, hope this was helpful to folks.